spring of 1918, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, sprawled across the heart of warring Europe, faced a prospect of ruin. This war had begun as Austria's quarrel. With gaiety and cheers, the soldiers of the Habsburg Empire had marched to battle in 1914. The first enemy was Serbia, the impudent Slav kingdom over the border. The crushing of Serbia would be a warning to all the races under Austrian rule whose national ambitions were coming to the boil. But war with Serbia meant war with Russia. Harsh realities soon dispelled the Habsburg dream. In 1914, when the Austrian armies marched to aid their German allies against Russian invasion, they met with disaster. Counting the fearful Austrian losses in the battles of 1914, cynical Germans said, "We are fettered to a corpse." Yet, somehow, the corpse revived. Defending bitterly in the Carpathian Mountains, in the icy grip of winter, the Austrians held off the Russian advance. In 1915, Austrians and Germans together hurled the Russians out of Galicia. And at last, with German and Bulgarian help, the Austrians defeated the obstinate Serbs and overran their country. But it was also in 1915 that Austria found herself faced with another enemy. Italy, after long hesitation and tempted by promises of territorial gains after the war, joined the Allies. The Italian Prime Minister called this policy sacro egoismo, sacred egoism. For the first time in history, the outposts of two great armies faced each other across the Alpine peaks. Here, in a region of eternal ice and snow, of fierce storms and frequent avalanches, the Austrians held the commanding heights. Food and munitions, everything that the armies needed had to be supplied by cable railway or by patient mules. But it was against the eastern frontier that General Cadorna, the Italian chief of staff, threw his troops. His objective was the port of Trieste. The way to Trieste, across the river Isonzo, was blocked by three high plateaus. Again and again, the Italians attacked these gaunt, rocky hillsides, where every shell burst flung out deadly fragments of stone as well as iron. It was a battlefield, wrote Hindenburg, equal in desolation and horror to the Western Front. Indeed, in many respects, worse. By 1916, Austria was gravely weakened. In the summer of that year, another Russian offensive under General Brusilov smashed through the front in Galicia. Over 400,000 Austrians were taken prisoner. Once again, it was only German help that stemmed the tide. At the end of 1916, the Emperor Franz Joseph died.
There was very great mourning in Vienna, all over the place, in all classes of the population. Everybody felt a personal loss. When, a few days after, the funeral of the emperor took place, the streets were filled, the houses, the shops, even some lampposts were draped in black. We looked at the funeral with a sort of personal grief.
The Kaiser came to pay his last respects. The kings of Bulgaria, Bavaria, and Saxony, the German Crown Prince, the heir to the Turkish throne, and the Crown Prince of Sweden all escorted the dead emperor on his last journey to the Habsburg family tomb. It was the end of an era. The new emperor, Karl, faced the ruin war had brought on his once great empire. To preserve its crumbling facade from final collapse, he entered into secret peace negotiations with the French government, but they came to nothing. The German ambassador in Vienna reported,
"The longer the war lasts, the more strongly the simple question comes to the foreground: will Austria-Hungary be able to carry on the fight? Her resources of troops are nearly exhausted. The mood of depression is increased by the economic situation. The people in the suburbs of Vienna are starving. They are driven to despair by long queuing, which often brings no results. We are running the danger that the Habsburg monarchy will suddenly sicken and that Germany will share in its downfall."
the harsh realities of the war had bound the Habsburg Empire inextricably to Germany. Ludendorff decided,
the Austrian-Hungarian armies needed stiffening by German troops in order to prevent the collapse of Austria-Hungary. To send German divisions for purely defensive purposes is not a measure corresponding to our serious situation. The Austrian High Command must understand it is necessary to take the offensive.
A spearhead of 7 Austrian and 8 German divisions under command of a German general were assembled secretly in the mountains in the northern reaches of the Isonzo. Their objective was to break out of the mountains into the Venetian plain. On October the 24th, 1917, a heavy bombardment by gas and high explosive shell drenched the Italian positions on the Isonzo. The Italian trenches, dugouts and shelters were overwhelmed in a hurricane of fire. All communications to the rear were destroyed. Snow and sleet showers, the Austro-German army advanced 14 miles through the mountains. Many of the Italians were terrified when German troops appeared.
One glance at the Pickelhaube coming over the hill was enough.
By the end of the first day, the enemy had crossed the Isonzo, captured the key village of Caporetto, and taken 30,000 prisoners. The Italian Second Army was smashed and in headlong retreat.
It was impossible for us even to think of abandoning these positions that had cost hundreds or thousands of lives, to leave our dead there. We just couldn't believe it. Still, we had to withdraw.
An attempt was made to stand on the Tagliamento River, 30 miles back, but the enemy crossed by a half-destroyed bridge. The Italians went back again, 400,000 men, along roads blocked by refugees.
One of the most tiresome things, from a military point of view, were the Austrian motorcyclists and sidecars with light machine guns that used to appear from nowhere and disappear to nowhere after machine gunning a convoy or a crowd of refugees. And we felt the whole time kind of shame that we had been defeated.
Through the exhausted and beaten army, the word passed round. Andiamo a casa. We're going home. By 1917, the majority of Italian soldiers were weary of the war. An English officer wrote,
"They were desperately tired, physically and spiritually. Their food was insufficient and was continually reduced. They had to march for days to the trenches and back heavily laden. They were often at the mercy of stupid and brutal commanders who maintained discipline by means of bestial punishment. They got a few days' leave once a year, 2 postcards a week to write home. No amusements, no relaxation, no rest."
On the Piave River, a mere 15 miles from Venice, Cadorna managed to rally his troops.
"We have taken the inflexible decision to defend here the honor of Italy. The Italian nation commands us to die and not to yield."
On the Piave, after a retreat of 70 miles, the Italians held the enemy at bay. In under 3 weeks, they had lost 400,000 men, of whom 360,000 were either prisoners or deserters.
The approach of the war to within 15 miles of Venice has produced inevitable changes. The ducal palace is no more than a soulless skeleton boarded up and emptied. Such shops as are still open are selling off their goods. Those Venetians who have stayed are calm and hoping for the best. The Grand Canal with its shuttered palaces has a mournful but noble air. Most of the gondolas are gone.
Five British and 6 French divisions were sent to Italy. The arrival of the British was observed by the historian G.M. Trevelyan.
The dull anxiety that overhung that November month seemed lifted as they marched by. I believe that the Italians, civil and military, were as cheered as I was. Looking on such men, it seemed impossible that we could be beaten.
General Cadorna now gave way to the younger General Armando Diaz. Under his command, the Italian army made an astonishing recovery. The change in the heart of the country was no less remarkable. The armchair defeatists were silenced, the peacemongers put to shame. In the face of a common danger, the Italian people at last found unity. To the Austrian army, Caporetto brought much-needed relief and the welcome booty of huge stores of food. It drew together its many races: Austro-German, Magyars, Yugoslavs, Czechs, Romanians, and Poles. Morale improved. For a while, the troops could relax on full stomachs. But at home, there was no such unity. In the winter of 1917, the mutual dislikes of the different races throughout the empire was intensified by the unequal distribution of food. Vienna was starving, while Budapest had something to spare. The harvest was a failure. The administration, chaotic.
The rations became smaller and smaller as the war went on, and the black market flourished. Fairly officially, the quality of the food was so terrible. Bread, for instance, gave many people some eczema. Potatoes were very short too.
And it was bitterly cold. The electricity was cut. The gas was cut. The children were really underfed because we had very little milk. And we had to be very careful to have a drop for everyone.
In May 1918, the Emperor Karl was summoned by the Kaiser. His secret peace moves of the previous year had been made public by the French. His duplicity towards his German ally stood revealed. Now the Germans demanded that the Austrians attack again in Italy in support of their own offensive in France. This time there would be no German help. Reluctantly, Karl had to agree. The key to the whole Italian line on the Piave was the Monte Grappa, 5,000 feet high and dominating the plain below. It had become a symbol of Italian resistance during the fierce fighting of the previous winter.
On the 15th of June, the whirlwind burst on the Grappa. Within 5 hours, our defences were smashed, 3 of the key positions were lost, the Austrians looked down on Bassano. But the soldiers of the Grappa, worn out, decimated, dashed forward again and again to the counterattack. In 24 hours, all was over, and we could think of the Piave as inviolate.
Elsewhere, the Austrian attacks made some headway against 2 British divisions in the Asiago Plateau. Further east still, they crossed the Piave on a 15-mile front. But the attacks had been spread over too wide a frontage. The Austrians were short of ammunition, short of transport, short of food. Worst of all, the Piave now rose in flood. Within 3 days, counterattacks had thrown them back across the river with the loss of 150,000 men. On the sea, too, Austria had suffered a grievous blow. 2 Italian boats on patrol in the Adriatic torpedoed the dreadnought Sentish-Van, one of the most powerful ships in the Austrian Navy. The disaster hastened the end of Austrian hopes. In the Balkans, Germany's other ally, Bulgaria, stood cautiously on the defensive. Like Italy, Bulgaria had entered the war for territorial gain at the expense of her old enemy, Serbia. In 1915, as the Germans and Austrians invaded Serbia from the north, Bulgaria struck at her flank. Serbs begged for Allied help. But how could they help this landlocked, isolated country in the heart of the Balkan Mountains? Only with the aid of Serbia's ally, Greece. At the invitation of the Greek Prime Minister, Venizelos, British and French troops landed at Salonika.
The force owed its existence more to diplomatic necessities than to the foresight of the military. The expedition was launched not to defeat the enemy, but to rescue the remains of the Serbian army and to prevent the whole of the Balkans from becoming an Austro-German province.
But on the very day the Allies landed, Venizelos was dismissed by the pro-German King Constantine. The king declared that Greece would stay neutral. The Allies were too late to help the Serbians effectively. They found themselves in a neutral country teeming with German spies. In the bare hills north of Salonika, they entrenched in a vast camp, known ironically as the Bird Cage. Here they waited for the Bulgarians and Germans to advance. But they did not come.
All we prayed for and hoped for was, let us have some action. Let us get into things. Let us do something. We joined the army to fight for the old country, not to plouter about and dig trenches.
As the troops in the Bird Cage dug and made roads, reinforcements poured into Salonika. British, French, Italians, Russians, Serbians.
It was probably the most crowded city in the world, and the most polyglot. Sailors from half a dozen navies, Turks, Albanians and Greek, Balkan peasants in their rough frieze dresses, native soldiers, Algerians, Indians, Annamite and Senegalese. Salonika's cafes, cabarets, cinemas and music halls did a roaring trade. There were never quite enough for the thousands of strangers within the gates of the city.
For 9 months, the Allies waited. There was mistrust of Greek intentions, mistrust between the Allies, mistrust of the French commander, General Serrai. At last, in the early summer of 1916, the armies advanced north towards the distant mountains. The Bulgarians and Germans had had ample time to prepare. Everywhere they held the heights in great strength.
No matter where you were under observation. All they had to do was look down on you. You couldn't move by daylight at all.
In the heat and dust, the trench lines spread across the Balkan Peninsula, from the Aegean to Albania on the Adriatic. The sun beat down on the stony, treeless heights on the swampy plains. The temperature rose to 114 degrees. The British troops had no sun helmets. The director of medical services in Egypt thought they were unnecessary. With the heat came the mosquitoes, but there were not enough mosquito nets, not enough quinine.
In the summer of 1916, in every battalion, men went down by the 100. The medical services were overwhelmed. The difficulties of evacuating this flood of sick men were extreme.
In 1916, there were 30,000 cases of malaria. In 1917, 63,000. In 1918, 67,000.
It was then when you had an attack of malaria and you had, as a result, a chronic fit of depression, that it was hardest to keep one's reason. Long hours in the line, in one's lonely dugout, as one sat there and thought, shall I ever see home again and the people I love? That was the most dangerous moment for any man to have to face. And some poor chaps couldn't face it and shot and fell.
The British Army felt abandoned, forgotten.
We are far out of the limelight. People ask, what on earth is the Salonika army doing?
Lloyd George wrote,
Our Balkan force remained a miserable Cinderella among the Allied armies. The British War Office never loved it. The campaign was a wretched story of neglect, delay, and official bungling of essential supplies.
Winter brought a new enemy, cold. Day and night, the armies of both sides were exposed to the full blast of the blinding sleet, the icy wind. The temperature fell to 35 degrees below freezing. Men went down by the score with frostbite. The German High Command were content to remain on the defensive and let the Bulgarians hold the line.
It was more advantageous to know that 300,000 of the enemy were being chained to that distant region than drive them from the Balkan Peninsula and thence to the French theatre of war.
The Germans had other preoccupations in the Balkans. In 1916, Romania declared war on the Central Powers, and Bulgaria found herself with an enemy on her northern frontier. But Romanian ambitions exceeded their powers. The trouble is we are such babies, so unlearned in the art of war, wrote the Queen of Romania. She herself set an example befitting a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, distributing sweets, cigarettes, little crosses, and holy pictures. But crosses and holy pictures were not enough. The Romanian army was pitifully equipped and badly led. In the northwest, German and Austrian Alpine troops burst through the mountains into the central plain. Bucharest, the capital, fell without a struggle. In the south, Field Marshal Mackensen, with a mixed force of Germans, Bulgarians and Turks, had pushed up the Danube towards its mouth and captured the Black Sea port of Constanza. Three-quarters of the country had been overrun. And the following year, the Romanians sued for peace. The Romanian catastrophe completed the tale of unrelieved failure for the Allies in the Balkans. They now resorted to political weapons. The majority of Greeks were neither pro-Ally or pro-German. They just wanted to be left alone. But it didn't suit the Allies for Greece to remain neutral. By political and military pressure, including an Allied landing at Athens, King Constantine was forced to abdicate. Venizelos returned as premier, and Greece was induced to declare war on the Central Powers.
The conversion of the Greek army from a source of danger to a powerful ally completely changed the aspect of things in the Balkans and made a renewed offensive possible.
From Corfu came other reinforcements, 100,000 Serbians who had escaped from their country in 1915. They were dedicated to avenge that terrible defeat. In the words of Lloyd George, they were ravening to be up and at the foe. Now, mighty events elsewhere impinged on the Macedonian front. German defeats in the west had undermined Bulgaria's will to resist. Her peasant soldiers were weary of the war. They'd lived for too long on red garlic soup and maize bread. They'd suffered too long in the mountains without boots, without coats. There was no longer a German army to stiffen their morale. They began to slip away from the front to their neglected farms. On the 15th of September 1918, the Allied bombardment roared out, and the mountains echoed with its thunder. The fire of battle spread swiftly from west to east, as French, Serbians, Italians, Greeks, and British attacked the walls of rock that faced them. The main attack was made by the French and Serbians over mountains in places 7,000 feet high. Within a week, the Serbian army, inspired by the sight of their homeland, had stormed through the mountains to the valleys beyond. Now they were retracing the path of their bitter retreat 3 long years before. Velez, Skopje, Uskub, Niš, The towns of Serbia returned one after another into their hands. The Bulgarian commander-in-chief frantically called on the Germans for reinforcements. Hindenburg replied,
"As your excellency is aware, Germany is now engaged in a most terrific struggle on the Western Front. All our forces will be required for that purpose."
Only a small nucleus of German troops remained in Bulgaria, not enough to rally the demoralized Bulgarians.
It was impossible to stop their career, even though the forces of the pursuing enemy were weak. The moment the enemy approached, the Bulgarians fired a few rounds and then left their lines.
All along the line now, the Bulgarians were falling back, leaving behind the debris of a broken army.
The situation was fast becoming unbelievable. We were on the point of rolling up the whole line. Central Europe itself was before our eyes.
On September the 29th, a fortnight after the first assault, Bulgaria capitulated. The first of Germany's allies had cracked. "The Iron Thrones are falling," wrote one Englishman. The way lay open to Constantinople in the east, to the Habsburg Empire in the north. In Austria-Hungary, social discontent had reached a revolutionary pitch, as it had done in Russia. Mutinies had broken out among the Slovenes, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Bosnians, and the Slovakians. Bad news from the Western Front fanned the discontent. The Austrians asked themselves,
if Germany can no longer put up a defense, why don't they put an end to the fighting?
Austrian dependence on Germany was coming full circle. Endurance was stretched to breaking point. One soldier wrote to his mother,
"The life is unworthy of any human being. I ask myself how the motley collection of older men and young boys in their front positions endure this life. Insufficient food, tattered uniforms, no possibility of keeping oneself clean. I feel convinced that we can't go on like this."
On the 16th of October, the troops learned that the Emperor had proclaimed a federal constitution giving full autonomy to the nations of the Empire. It was too late. One after another, the peoples of the Empire cast off the Habsburg yoke. First the Czechoslovaks, then the Yugoslavs and the Hungarians proclaimed themselves as independent states. The tottering empire was splitting asunder. After 4 years, the shot at Sarajevo had at last achieved its true purpose. On the 24th of October, the anniversary of Caporetto, the Allies attacked in Italy. For 2 days, the Austrians hung on tenaciously in the mountains and along the line of the Piave. But on the 27th, the Allies broke through the river front. Three days later, cavalry and armored cars reached Vittorio Veneto, the Austrian headquarters. The retreat had turned into a rout. Now, at last, Austrian resistance was at an end. Her dream of empire was in ruins. The imperial eagle was at the point of death.